Dear audience, welcome to the show POWERchat. In today's episode, we'll be discussing about the labor market and ethical recruitment. Joining us today is Ms. Marie Apostol, Chief Executive Officer at the Fair Hiring Initiative in the Philippines. Please allow me to welcome her. Welcome to the show, Ms. Apostol.
Thank you so much, Laxman.
How have you been?
I've been very good.
So you are here in Nepal for facilitating a training with the recruitment agencies.
Yes,
Could you tell us about the training? What have you discussed with the stakeholders?
We're discussing a set of standards of behavior for recruitment agencies that we hope will promote ethical standards in the recruitment process.
How was it?
Excellent. We trained about 30 people in the room on ethical recruitment standards, and I think there's a lot of optimism and real positive energy moving into that, into ethical recruitment.
Well, Ms. Apostol, you have been into the field of conducting interactions with the stakeholders, especially in the labor issues, ethical recruitment for a long time, almost 2 decades, and leading an organization, the Fair Hiring Initiative in the Philippines. And you are often visiting Nepal for discussing these issues. How do you observe the labor market as such, referring to Nepal, in terms of the ethical recruitment?
Okay. Well, as we all know, and you know very well, Nepal is a great supplier of people to external foreign labor markets, and I think it is going to continue to be so. There's a huge demand for Nepali workers in places like Malaysia, in places like Qatar, and I think with increasing scrutiny on recruitment by external stakeholders, there will be an increasing push towards ethical recruitment.
What are the major findings? You also engaged in auditing of ethical issues, whether the stakeholders, especially recruiting agencies, are following to the ethical standards or not. What are the findings of your audit that you were engaged in the past with these agencies?
Well, I started my work about in 1998 doing social audits of workplaces. So not the recruitment agencies themselves, but mainly the workplaces or the employers where workers are sent. And what we were finding in our work was that one of the most vulnerable people in any workplace, were foreign workers. We were finding that they were most vulnerable to abuse, most vulnerable to wage issues, most vulnerable to benefits issues, but they never complained. And we wondered why. And we found out that one of the things that was keeping them from talking about, from complaining, was because these people had paid a large amount of money in their home countries, whether it was Nepal, whether it was Indonesia, whether it was Vietnam or the Philippines. They had paid an enormous amount of money to get the job in that foreign country. And because they had paid that much money, sometimes as high as $3,000 and sometimes the equivalent of 12 months of their pay, they were afraid to complain because they could be sent home, and they would forfeit, the opportunity to regain their investment of money paid to their agents in the home country. So we started to understand better that the vulnerability of these workers didn't have to do with the workplace situation. It had also to do with how they were deployed in the first place. So all of the fees that were charged to them to get there. So we were looking at these issues as a form of forced labor and slavery, because who in this modern world would work for 12 months and their salary
without
goes
getting salary,
without getting a salary. Their salary goes to someone
paying
else.
it to someone else.
Exactly.
Who are responsible for these all things?
It's a really complex problem, because we could easily vilify recruitment agents, right? Oh, they're taking all this money. But on the other hand, there are employers who do not pay for recruitment costs. Recruitment, even of foreign workers, is an integral business function. If we're hiring workers, it has a cost. If we're hiring workers from another country, then we still have to pay those costs. The problem is there's been so much, the market, the labor market in sending countries has been filled with job seekers who are so desperate for jobs that they're willing to pay to get the jobs, and on the other hand, the employers are happy to receive workers without having to pay for the cost of doing so. And the recruitment agency in Nepal, and possibly their partner in Malaysia or Qatar, facilitates that arrangement. And unfortunately, in a lot of cases, it's the recruitment agencies that earn from this, and of course the employers benefit from not having to pay these costs, all of which are borne by workers.
Well, what is the role of the government and the existing laws in terms of Nepal? Nepal is one of the major labor sending countries, especially in this region. Many workers from this country are going to Middle East in search of job. What is the role of government and the laws? Nepal is, a state party to many international treaties, including that of the ILO conventions.
Yes. I think the government has really tried to limit the fees that are charged to workers. They've tried to set really transparent fee schedules and limits on how much agents can charge workers for, how much workers should be charged for accommodations, for service fees, etc. The problem is, as in many governments like the Philippines, Thailand, Indonesia, we have regulations, but the enforcement of these regulations becomes very difficult to do. And it's not because, sometimes it's because of a lack of will to enforce. There are issues of corruption everywhere, but also it has to do with resources. How do you monitor 800 licensed agencies in Nepal, and whether every single one of them is following regulations? So it's a difficult issue for the Nepal government. The other thing is, Nepal, like all sending country governments, benefit from the remittances of the workers that go out to work in the Gulf and in Malaysia. And there is that, interest to continue to send them out. So if the economy is benefiting from the remittances of the workers going out, it's a bit harder to put in to enforce really the protective restrictions, because it could stop the flow of remittances, right? So there are a lot of different interests. What we're interested in seeing is how do businesses themselves help by setting up voluntary regulations or standards that go even beyond some country laws.
Yeah, Ms. Apostol, very interesting issues you are raising. I will come back to you on the voluntary regulations that needs to be set by the agencies themselves. What about the awareness level of these agencies on the existing laws.
Mm.
Is this happening because of the lack of knowledge about the existing laws, that if there is something that is fraud, that is against the labor's rights or workers' rights, such incidents are taking place, they would be punished? They are not aware about such punishment, or they are not aware about Nepal's international obligations, especially into the labor treaties or labor laws.
You know what? It's difficult to say that the agencies don't understand the regulations, because every agency must understand its licensing regulations to be able to get the license and registered. But I think what is not understood is that some behaviors really contribute to things like forced labor and even slavery and human trafficking. I think there's the fact that certain things have been done this way for the longest time, the embedded nature of these practices, the entrenched nature of these practices, and the fact that they have become common practice has caused these types of behaviors to proliferate, and people don't think about it anymore, right? It's only now that they're beginning, because of external pressures by stakeholders, nonprofits, consumers, investors who are looking at these issues. It's only now that they're beginning to think about, look at how they're doing things from a different perspective, and seeing that we thought we were helping workers. A lot of these agents think they're really helping workers to get a job and to earn some money, along the way profiting, of course, from that. But there are a lot of things that need to change simply because of entrenched interests, entrenched beliefs, entrenched relationships, not just between agents and the government, or between agents and their sub-agents, but also between, relationships between workers and who they trust to get them a job. So there are a lot of agents who are licensed that are trying to follow an employer's pay policy, which is what the government is trying to move towards, that employers pay for recruitment costs, like for tickets and visas, which previously were allowed to be charged to Nepali workers. But there is a complex chain, supply chain, of agents and sub-agents that the worker goes through from the village before they even reach Kathmandu to be processed for a job. So it is, how do you regulate the behaviors of every single person in that chain, most of which are not authorized, are not registered, are not known to the government. I'm told that there are maybe about 1,500 sub-agents registered with the government, but there could be 15,000 of them operating in Nepal, maybe more. Don't quote me on the numbers, but a lot of them.
How do you define the ethical standards, at a time when there is problem with the laws and regulations? You are mentioning that there are many stakeholders, from agents to sub-agents to recruiting agencies, then employer, companies, industries. How can stakeholders agree upon a common standards of ethics so that the workers find a way towards a dignified working environment at the destination country?
Well, of course, the bedrock of all labor standards and laws have already been developed by the International Labour Organization, by the UN, and that there are standards for how workers need to be treated. And I think these are the provenance of stakeholder codes, right? I've been working on supply chain corporate social responsibility, meaning how does, in a supply chain, how does a buyer of goods, like a big company, and let's just say an Apple, because it's so popular, how does an Apple use its power as a buyer of goods from its suppliers, the people who make the Apple products? How does it use its power as a buyer to create change in the supply chain? So if what corporations are now doing is they are setting a set of standards by which their suppliers need to behave, and they're using it as procurement standards. So if you don't behave in a certain way, you're not. If you start underpaying your workers, treating them badly, putting them in untenable disciplinary situations, or creating forced labor situations for your workers, then a company like Apple could say, I will buy from another company. I'll ask my products to be made by another company because I don't want any product that bears the Apple brand to be associated with any kind of forced labor or other labor issues. So the standards become contractual in nature. It becomes part of the business contract. And those are the standards that we have started to use using the supply chain model, right? The supply chain leverage that this is a brand, this is a manufacturer that they buy from, and this is the labor supplier that provides the workers to the manufacturer. So the labor supplier or the agent may be one agent in Malaysia, one agent in Nepal. So now they're putting the pressure on these labor suppliers simply because of they're seeing, the world is seeing, that a lot of issues related to forced labor and to making a lot of foreign workers very vulnerable have to do with the way they were recruited. So now the scrutiny is on the recruitment chain. And there are now standards of behavior that are being enforced or applied to recruitment agencies, not just to manufacturing companies or service companies. So that's where it's coming from. And I think it has to do with the fact that when you talk about forced labor and slavery, they are so resonant, right, to a consumer. Will I buy something that is made by slaves? I don't want to do that. No, so it's something that so many different stakeholder groups have united against, and I think the important thing is that they're unified on the standards. They're unified on what constitutes forced labor in the recruitment process. They're unified on the fact that workers should not be paying for recruitment costs, that the employer should pay for these costs. They're unified on standards related to workers should keep their passports, keep their identity documents. They're unified on standards that say a worker should have the terms and conditions of work should be transparent to the worker from the time they're recruited up to and it should be aligned to the contract terms that they sign. So all of these things, the transparency piece, and then of course that there's no bribery in the process or corruption.
Yeah, Ms. Apostol, very interesting one. How often do you or the stakeholders, the initiatives like yours, interact with the workers or laborers themselves? Because these interactions, there is complaint that are limited to agencies or the companies.
Mm-hmm. Right.
How often do you interact with them, and how do you ensure that there is high level of awareness among the workers about these all issues?
When we talk about the audit process, the social audit process, a key piece of that, a key component of that is worker interviews. I mean, the information from workers is essential to getting the real information on these issues, because in some cases the worker is the only credible source of information about whether fees were paid in the sending country, because there are no there are no receipts. I mean, why would an agent give a worker a receipt if they were charging them exploitative costs? There's no paper trail, and there is mutual interest between the agent and the employer to cover up fees charged to workers. So the worker's voice, as you say, is so important in this. We wouldn't know what happened. We wouldn't have any information about fees paid or any exploitative behaviors that happened to the worker, except when the worker actually talks about it. And it's been difficult. In the past, it was difficult at first for workers to talk about it, because they felt that, one, if they talked, they might be sent home. Number two, they were told. A lot of them are coached by their agents to not say anything about any bad things about them. Number three, and three, sometimes they're threatened that if you talk about these fees, I could you'll be sent back home, or I could even harm your family. So the workers actually believe they take a risk when they speak about these things. So it takes really good interview skills to actually bring this out from workers. A lot of workers, it's interesting, a lot of workers don't complain if they actually have a job. Even if they paid a lot of money, they don't complain if the job is there and they actually get the wages that they were promised. They start complaining. Most of the workers that complain to governments are those that actually were tricked into paying for jobs that actually did not exist.
Well, Ms. Apostol, there are many interesting issues, but we are coming to the end of the show. Finally, and very quickly, could you tell us how can one maintain a very functional reporting or grievance mechanism so that these issues are noticed publicly and there are efforts that the workers' rights are not violated in future? Very quickly.
You have to have a system that's accessible to workers, that they will not afraid to use, that they can trust will not be retaliatory against them. There will be no retaliation against them for reporting any of these complaints. And I think the best way is to have to show a worker that action is actually taken on their complaints. I think it's the idea of good faith, right, on the part of whoever is operating this grievance or complaints mechanism, making it robust and accessible to all, making workers aware that they can report and that something will actually be done if they do, right? I think that's when workers would trust it more. And I think if we make that grievance mechanism or complaints mechanism something that actually informs policy and implementing structures and processes on the government side, so they know they're hearing what workers are saying and where workers need to be protected, then I think it would make for it would be a really good source of information for government on how they can manage recruitment better.
Well, thank you very much for your time. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you, Laxman.
Dear audience, time now to wrap up the show. Keep watching us. See you next week. Namaste.